In ancient Rome, 6,000 people were nailed to crosses along a single road and left to suffocate under their own weight. In Persia, a man was said to be sealed between two boats and kept alive for 17 days while insects ate him. In China, an executioner cut a condemned man apart one slow slice at a time, trained to keep him conscious to the end. Assyrian kings flayed rebels alive and pinned them to their own city walls, then carved it across their palaces as a warning. In Egypt, tomb robbers were driven onto a stake, lesser criminals lost their noses so everyone would know. Rome sewed murderers into a sack with a live snake and drowned them, and fed the condemned to wild animals before a cheering crowd. And Greece gave its citizens a quiet cup of poison and threw everyone else into a pit. These are the worst punishments the ancient world ever built. And here's the strange part. The most famous one on this list is probably a lie. And the real ones were never about cruelty at all, they were about power and who has it. So before we reach the boats and the blades and the crosses, we start somewhere much quieter. You're standing in a crowd on a riverbank. It's 1750 BC, the city is Babylon, and the man being walked to the water has his hands tied behind his back. Nobody here is confused about what happens next. There's no lawyer, no appeal, no moment where somebody checks the paperwork, because the paperwork is a slab of black stone standing in the middle of town, and it already told you how this ends. And here's the part that should bother you. That stone isn't a record of chaos. It's the opposite. It's one of the first serious attempts in human history to make punishment fair. So this is the story of the worst punishments the ancient world came up with and why they existed at all. Not medieval Europe. Not the Inquisition, not the Tower of London. We're going further back, Babylon, Egypt, Assyria, China, Rome, to the first few thousand years after somebody decided that hurting people should be written down and organized. Start with the obvious question. What changes when you write law down? Because for most of human history, there was no law. There was just, you hurt my brother, so my family comes for yours. Anthropologists call it a blood feud, and its defining problem is that it never stops. Your cousin kills mine, so I kill 2 of yours, so you kill 4 of mine. Escalation isn't a bug in revenge. It's the whole mechanism, which is why the earliest written laws are mostly trying to shut that down. The oldest we have is the Code of Hammurabi, around 2100 BC. And if you expect a horror show, it isn't one. Knock out a man's tooth, 2 shekels of silver. Cut off his foot, 10 shekels. It's a prize list. Then Hammurabi turns up and carves his code onto a pillar of black stone 2 meters tall, the one now standing in the Louvre. 282 laws. And this is where the line you know comes from. If a man destroys the eye of another man, they destroy his eye. An eye for an eye. Everybody quotes that as proof of how barbaric these people were, and everybody has it backwards. Look at what it replaces. Under the feud, taking my eye costs your whole family. Under Hammurabi, it costs 1 eye. That's it. It isn't permission to escalate. It's a ceiling. And the good news lasts about 4 seconds, because look at the next 2 laws. Destroy the eye of a commoner, pay silver. Destroy a slave's eye, pay half his market value to the owner. An eye for an eye, but only if the 2 eyes belong to men of the same rank. And the law that tells you the most is Law 2. Accuse a man of sorcery and fail to prove it, and he gets thrown in the river. If the river takes him, you inherit his house. If he climbs out alive, he's innocent, and they execute you instead. That's trial by ordeal. And the point of it is simple. If the river decides, no human being has to be responsible for getting it wrong. Egypt. And Egypt is special because in Egypt we get actual court records. Around 1100 BC, the state investigated a wave of royal tomb robberies, and the files survive. One holds the confession of a stonemason who broke into a king's tomb and stripped the gold off the bodies. He didn't volunteer it. The papyrus says flatly that he was examined by beating on his hands and the soles of his feet. Examined. That's the word beating written into the case file like you'd log a receipt. And the sentence for tomb robbery was impalement, being placed upon the wood. Slow and public, and that's severe because robbing a tomb wasn't filed as theft. It was an attack on a god. Egypt also cut off noses as a sentence, and this is where it gets interesting. Why mutilate somebody instead of just killing them? Because there were no prisons, no photographs, no files that could track a person across a country. So the mutilation is the criminal record. It's a sentence you carry on your face, readable by every stranger you'll ever meet. Then there's Assyria, who took all of this and turned up the volume because the Assyrians did something new. They turned punishment into advertising. Their kings wrote annals boasting about flaying rebel leaders and impaling defenders around their own city walls. And then they carved it onto the palace walls, where foreign ambassadors were walked past it on purpose. Ask why a king would pay for that. Because Assyria ran an enormous territory with a small army, and the substitute for having soldiers everywhere is a reputation that gets there first. Which gives us the rule for the whole rest of this: the spectacular punishments don't belong to the cruelest societies. They belong to states that can't enforce the law everywhere and are trying to be feared instead of present. China systematized it harder than anyone. The old framework was the 5 punishments: branding the face, cutting off the nose, amputating a foot, castration, death. A fixed ladder applied by offense. It's the ancestor of every sentencing grid ever written. And then the one you actually clicked for, lingchi, death by 1,000 cuts, which was real and was not 1,000 cuts. The whole point was that it ran in a slow, controlled sequence, and it was reserved for the very top of the code: treason and killing your own parents. China formally abolished it in 1905. And the reason you've heard of it at all is that a few photographs were taken right at the end of its life, and those photographs did something strange to the Western imagination. Rome didn't invent crucifixion. What Rome did was industrialize it and aim it very deliberately at slaves, rebels, and foreigners. Roman citizens were, in principle, exempt. Class again. It's always class. After the slave revolt under Spartacus was crushed, 6,000 of the captured were crucified along the road to Rome. 200 kilometers of road lined at intervals for everybody traveling to the capital to walk past. And crucifixion kills by exhaustion, hanging by your arms. You can't breathe out unless you push up on your legs until eventually you can't. It takes hours, sometimes days, and it was designed to. Rome had stranger sentences too. Kill your own father and you were sewn into a leather sack with a dog, a rooster, and a snake, and thrown in the river. And then there was the arena. Condemnation to the beasts was a formal legal sentence carried out at midday in front of a paying crowd. Execution wasn't hidden behind a wall. It was the interval entertainment. Which raises the real question under all of this. Why does nearly every ancient punishment insist on being watched? Because the punishment isn't really about the person being punished. That person is the medium. The message is for the 20,000 people in the seats, and it doesn't work unless they show up. Greece makes the point sharpest. Athens executed condemned citizens with hemlock, a quiet cup in a quiet room, which is how Socrates died. Non-citizens got fastened to a board in public, or thrown into a pit outside the walls. Same city, same crime. One sentence is a cup. The other is a pit. If you want to know a society's real hierarchy, don't read what it says about equality. Read how it kills. Which finally brings us to the thing sitting at number 1 on every list of ancient torture: Scaphism. The boats. And it does deserve a number 1 slot, just on a different list. The list of things everybody knows that nobody can verify. The story goes that you're sealed between 2 boats, force-fed milk and honey, and left on stagnant water in the sun while insects finish you over 17 days. But follow the source. It comes from Plutarch, writing about 500 years after the event, leaning on a Greek physician other ancient writers openly accused of making things up. No Persian record. No archaeology. Nothing behind it at all. Persia absolutely executed people brutally, that part is well attested. But this one elaborate 17-day insect procedure is exactly the kind of detail a hostile foreigner invents when he wants a rival empire to sound inhuman. And the boats won anyway. 2,500 years later, it's still the first thing people picture. A great horror story travels. A clay tablet full of silver prices does not. So put the pattern together, because it showed up everywhere we looked. 3 things predict how brutal a society's punishments are, and none of them is how cruel its people were. 1. Whether the state can actually catch you. Fewer officials means the only lever left is making the consequence unforgettable. 2. Whether the punishment is public. A punishment nobody sees deters nobody. 3. Rank. Always rank. These systems exist to hold a hierarchy in place, and they say so in writing. And every one of these systems built itself an exit. India's Great Manual of Statecraft lists mutilations offense by offense, and then lists the exact fine you can pay instead of each one. A schedule of bodily harm with a checkout counter attached, which tells you what it really was. A punishment you can buy your way out of was never about justice. It was about who has silver. Although, look at the Aztecs for the sharpest inversion in the whole story. Under one of their law codes, a commoner caught drunk in public got shamed and shaved. A nobleman doing exactly the same thing could be executed. That's the one system here that aimed its worst punishments upward at the people with the most power, on the logic that a leader who can't govern himself is a public hazard. Sit with how rare that is. Almost every other code does the precise opposite. Now here's the uncomfortable part, and it isn't the one you're braced for. Because the obvious ending is thank God we stopped, and we did stop most of it. Public execution, judicial mutilation, trial by ordeal, gone from nearly every legal system on Earth. That's real in its progress. But look at how it went. Punishment didn't leave. It moved indoors out of sight and turned from damage into duration. The modern descendant of the ancient method is a room. Prolonged solitary confinement is measurable harm. Sustained isolation wrecks sleep, memory, and the ability to regulate fear in weeks, not years. I'm not telling you a modern prison equals impalement. It doesn't. The claim is narrower and harder to dodge. That crowd on the riverbank knew exactly what was being done in their name because they were required to stand there and watch. We've arranged things so we don't have to. We made the same decisions invisible and then mistook not seeing them for not doing them. So what is a punishment really? It's a society writing down what frightens it most. Babylon feared the feud. Egypt feared anything touching the dead. Syria feared rebellion at the edge of an empire it could barely reach. Rome feared its slaves. Read the sentences and you learn the fear. And by that measure, the worst punishment in the ancient world was never a device. It wasn't the boats or the pit. It was the ordinary legal arrangement where the same act cost a poor man his hand and cost a rich man a coin, running through every civilization that ever bothered to write its laws down. Which is why Hammurabi's stone matters more than any of the horror stories. Almost nobody in Babylon could read it. It was a monument standing in public, so the city could see that punishment now came down from the top of the state instead of across from your neighbor. That was the invention. Everything since has been an argument about the settings. So go back to the riverbank. It's 1750 BC, you're in the crowd, and the man with his hands tied is being walked to the water. You're not there because you're cruel. You're there because the law requires witnesses, and because the entire point of what's about to happen is that you go home and tell people about it. And you will. That's the one part of all this that never got abolished. 4,000 years later, you're still watching a punishment, and you're still passing it on. You're doing it right now. Okay. You actually made it to the end. That already puts you in rare company. So before you go, do the one thing this whole video was quietly asking for. Hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, it tells me to keep making these, and honestly, after everything you just watched, it is the least horrifying thing anyone has asked of you all day. Subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.